But the years roll on, and honor is no consolation. Recollections either melt away or else acquire a deathly gloss, so that instead of marvelous apparitions, we are left with a fan of picture postcards. Nothing can help here, no poetry, no stereoscope, that gadget which in ominous bug-eyed silence used to endow a cupola with such convexity and surround mug-carrying Carlsbad promenaders with such a diabolical semblance of space that I was tormented by nightmares after this optical diversion far more than after tales of Mongolian tortures. The particular stereo camera I remember adorned the awaiting room of our dentist, an American named Lawson, whose French mistress, Madame Ducamp, a gray-haired harpy, seated at her desk among vials of blood-red Lawson mouthwash, pursed her lips and nervously scratched her scalp as she tried to find an appointment for Tanya and me, and finally, with an effort and a screech, managed to push her spitting pen between La Princesse Tourmanoff and a blot at the end, and Monsieur Danzas with a blot at the beginning. Here is a description of a drive to this dentist, who had warned the day before that this one will have to come out. What will it be like to be sitting half an hour from now in this brougham? With what eyes shall I look at these snowflakes and black branches of trees? How shall I follow again with my gaze that conical curbstone in its cotton wool cap? How recall on my way back my way there? While with revulsion and tenderness, constantly feeling the handkerchief wherein carefully folded is something like an ivory watch charm. That cotton wool cap is not only ambiguous, but does not even begin to express what I meant, namely the snow-piled cap-like on granite cones joined by a chain somewhere in the vicinity of the statue of Peter the Great. Somewhere! Alas, it is already difficult for me to gather all the parts of the past. Already I am beginning to forget relationships and connections between objects, and still thrive in my memory objects I thereby condemn to extinction. If so, what insulting mockery to affirm smugly that thus a former impression keeps lying within harmony's ice. What, then, compels me to compose poems about my childhood in spite of everything? My words go wide in the mark, or else slay both the pard and the heart with the exploding bullet of an accurate epithet? But let us not despair. The man says I am a real poet, which means that the hunt was not in vain. Here is under 12-line poem about boyhood torments. It deals with the ordeals of winter in town, when, for example, ribbed stockings chafe behind the knees, or when shopgirl pulls an impossibly fat kid glove into your hand, laid on the counter as if on an executioner's block. There is more, the hook's double pinch, the first time it slipped off, while you stand with outspread arms to have your fur collar fastened. But in compensation for this, what an amusing change in acoustics, how rounded all sounds become when the collar is raised. And since we have touched upon ears, how unforgettable the silky, taut, buzzing music when the strings of your cap's ear flaps are being tied. Raise your chin, merrily, to coin a phrase. Youngsters romp on a frosty day. At the entrance to the public park, we have the balloon vendor. Above his head, 3 times his size, an enormous rustling cluster. Look, children, how they billow and rub against each other, all full of God's sunshine, red, blue, and green shades. A beautiful sight. Please, Uncle, I want the biggest, the white one with the rooster painted on it and a red embryo floating inside, which, when its mother is destroyed, will escape up to the ceiling, and a day later will come down all wrinkled and quite tame. Now the happy children have bought their ruble balloon, and the kindly hawker has pulled it out of the jostling bunch. Just a minute, my lad, don't grab, let me cut the string, after which he puts on his mittens again, checks the string round his waist, and from which his scissors dangle, and pushing off with his heel, slowly begins to rise in an upright position higher and higher into the blue sky. Look, his cluster is now than a bunch of grapes, while beneath him lies hazy, gilded, berimmed St. Petersburg, a little restored here and there, alas, according to the best pictures of our national printers. But joking aside, it really was all very beautiful, very quiet. The trees in the park mimed their own ghosts, and the whole effect revealed immense talent. Tanya and I would make fun of the sleds of our coeval, especially if they were covered in fringed carpet-like stuff and had a high seat equipped even with a back, and reins that the rider held as he braked with his felt boots. This kind never made it all the way to the final snowdrift, but instead went off course almost immediately and began to spin helplessly while continuing to descend, carrying a pallid, intent child who was obliged, when the sled's momentum was spent, to work with his feet in order to reach the end of the icy run. Tanya and I had weighty bell sleds from Singalis. Such a sled consisted simply of a rectangular velvet cushion on iron runners curved at each end. You did not have to pull it on the way to slide. It glided with so little effort and so impatiently along the snow, sanded in vain, that it bumped against your heels. Here we are at the hill. One climbed up at a sparkle-splashed platform. Water carried up in buckets to pour on the side had splashed over the wooden steps that they were coated with sparkling ice, but the well-meaning alliteration had not been able to get all this in. One climbed a sparkle-splashed platform, one dashingly fell belly first on the sled, and it rattled down the blueness, and then, when the scene underwent a grim change, and their sombre burned in the nursery, scarlet fever on Christmas or on Easter diphtheria, one rocketed down the bright, brittle, exaggerated ice hill in a kind of half-tropical, half-Tavrichesky park, where by the power of delirium General Nikolai Mihailovich Shrevelsky was transferred, together with his stone camel, from the Alexandrovsky Park near us, and where he immediately turned into a statue of my father, who was at that moment somewhere between Kokand and Ashgabat, for example, or else on a slope of the Sinin Range. What illnesses Tanya and I went through, now together, now by turns, and how I would suffer when I heard, between the slam of the distant door and the restrained quiet sound of another one, her footfall and laughter bursting through, sounding celestially different to me, unaware of me, infinitely distant from my fat compress with its tawny oilcloth filling, my aching legs, my bodily heaviness and constriction. But if it was she who was sick, how earthly and real, how like the crisp soccer ball I felt when I saw her lying in bed with an air of remoteness about her, as if she had turned toward the other world, with only the limp lining of her being toward me. Let us describe the last stand before the capitulation, when, not yet having stepped out of the normal course of the day, concealing from your own self the fever, the ache in your joints, and wrapping yourself up Mexican fashion, you disguise the claims of fever's chill as the demands of the game, and when a half-hour later you have surrendered and ended up in bed, your body no longer believes that just a short time ago it was playing, crawling on all fours along the floor of the hall, along the parquet, along the carpet. Let us describe Mother's questioning smile of alarm when she has just put the thermometer in the armpit, a task she had not entrusted either to the valet or to the governess. "Well, you've got yourself in a nice fix, haven't you?" says she, still trying to make a joke of it. Then a minute later, "I knew it yesterday. I knew you had a fever. You can't fool me." And after another minute, "How much do you think you have?" And finally, "I think we can take it out now." She brings the incandescent glass tube close to the light, and drawing together her lovely sealskin eyebrows, which Tanya has inherited, she looks for a long time, and then without saying anything she unhurriedly shakes the thermometer and slips it back into its case, looking at me as if not quite recognizing me, while my father rides his horse at a walk across a vernal plain all blue with irises. Let us describe also the delirious state in which one feels huge numbers grow, inflating one's brain, accompanied by someone's incessant patter quite unrelated to you, as if in the dark garden adjoining the madhouse of the book of Psalms several of its characters half out, or more precisely 57 111ths out, of their terrible world of increasing interest, appeared in their stock parts of apple-woman, 4 ditch-diggers, and a certain person who has bequeathed his children a caravan of fractions, and chatted, to the accompaniment of nocturnal saw of trees, about something extremely domestic and silly, but therefore all the more awful, all the more doomed to turn into those very numbers, into that mathematical universe expanding endlessly, an expansion which for me sheds an odd light on the macrocosmic theories of today's physicists. Let us describe finally the recovery, when there is no longer any point in shaking the mercury down, and the thermometer is carelessly left lying on the bed table, wherein is simply of books that has come to congratulate you and a few playthings. Idle onlookers are crowding up the half-empty bottles of turbid potions. A writing case with my note-paper is what I most vividly see. The leaves are adorned with a horseshoe and my monogram. I have become quite an expert in twisted initials, insiglio seals, dry fattened flowers, which a little girl sent me from Nice, and sealing wax, red and bronze gleaming. None of the poems in the book alludes to a certain extraordinary thing that happened to me when I was recovering from a particularly severe case of pneumonia. When everyone had moved into the drawing-room, to use a Victorian cliché, one of the guests who had to go on with it, had been silent all evening. The fever had ebbed away during the night, and I had finally scrambled ashore. I was, let me tell you, weak, capricious, and transparent as a cut glass egg. Mother had gone to buy me, I did not know what exactly, one of those freakish things that come from time to time. I coveted with the greed of a pregnant woman, afterwards forgetting them completely. My mother made lists of 3 desiderata. As I lay flat in my bed, among bluish layers of indoor twilight, I felt myself evolving in incredible lucidity, as when a distant stripe of radiantly pale sky stretches between long vesperal clouds, and you can make out the cape and shallows of God knows what far-off islands, and it seems that if you release your volatile glance just a little further, you will discern a shining boat drawn up on the damp sand and receding footsteps filled with the bright water. In that minute, I think I attained the highest limit of human health. My mind had been dipped and rinsed only recently in a dangerous, supernaturally clean blackness, and now lying still and not even shutting my eyes, I mentally saw my mother in chinchilla coat and black-dotted veil, getting into the sleigh, which always seemed to know Russia, so small compared to the tremendous stuffed bottom of the coachman, and holding her dove-gray fluffy muff to her face, she sped behind a pair of black horses covered with a blue net. Street after street unfolded without any effort on my part. Lumps of coffee-colored snow pounded against the sleigh's front. Now it has stopped. Vasily, the footman, steps down from the footboard, in the same motion unfastening the bearskin lap robe, and my mother walks briskly toward a shop whose name and display I do not have time to identify, since just that instant my uncle, her brother, passes by and hails her. She has already disappeared, and for several steps I involuntarily accompany him, trying to make out the face of the gentleman with whom he is chatting as they both walk away, but catching myself, I turn back and hastily flow, as it were, into the store, where my mother is already paying 10 rubles for a perfectly ordinary green Faber pencil, which is then lovingly wrapped in brown paper by 2 clerks and handed to Vasily, who is already carrying it behind my mother to the sleigh, which now speeds along anonymous streets back to our house, now advancing to meet it, but here the crystalline course of my clairvoyance was interrupted by Ivana Ivanovna's arrival with broth and toast. I needed her help to sit up in bed. She gave the pillow a swat and placed her bed tray, with its midget feet and perpetually sticky area now at its southwestern corner, across the animated blanket before me. Suddenly the door opened and Mother came in, smiling and holding a long brown paper package like a halberd. From it emerged a Faber pencil a yard long, of corresponding thickness, a display giant that had hung horizontally in the window as an advertisement, and had once happened to arouse my whimsical greed. I must still have been in that blissful state when any oddity descends among us like a demigod to mingle unrecognized with the Sunday crowd, since at that moment I felt no amazement at what happened to me, but only remarked to myself in passing how I had been mistaken in regard to the object's size. But later, when I had grown stronger and plugged up certain chinks with bread, I would ponder with superstitious pangs about my clairvoyant spell, the only one I ever experienced, of which I was so ashamed that I concealed it even from Tanya. I nearly burst into tears from embarrassment when we happened to meet, on my very first trip outdoors, a distant relative of Mother's, one Gadukov, who said to her, "Your brother and I saw you the other day near Truman's." Meanwhile, the air in all the poems has grown warmer, and we are preparing to return to the country, where we might move as early as April in the years before I begin school. I began it only at the age of 12. The snow, gone from the slopes, lurks in ravines, and Petersburg's spring is full of excitement and anemones and the first butterflies. But I don't need last year's Vanessas, those bleached hibernators, or those utterly battered brimstones through transparent woods flying. I shall not fail, though, to detect the 4 lovely gauze wings of the softest geometrid moth in the world, spread flat on a mottled pale birch trunk. This poem is the author's own favorite, but he did not include it in the collection because, once again, the theme is connected with that of his father, and economy of art advised him not to touch that theme before the right time came. Instead, he reproduced such strong impressions as the first sensation immediately upon walking out of the station. The softness of the ground, its kindred proximity to your foot, and around your head the totally unrestrained flow of air, being with each other, furiously lavishing invitations, standing up on their boxes, flourishing their free hand, and mingling their uproar with exaggerated woes. The droshky drivers called to the early arrivals. A little way off, an open motor car, crimson both inside and out, awaited us. The idea of speed had already given a slant to the steering wheel. Sea cliff trees were understand, I mean. While its general appearances still retained out of false sense of propriety, I suppose, a servile leap with the shape of a Victoria, but if this was indeed an attempt at mimicry, that it was totally destroyed by the roar of the motor, with the muffler bypass opened, a roar so ferocious that long before we came in sight, a peasant on a hay wagon coming the other way would jump off and try to hood his horse with a sack, after which he and his cart would often end up in the ditch or even in the field, where a minute later, having already forgotten us and our dust, the rural stillness would collect again, cool and tender, with only the tiniest aperture left for the song of a skylark. Perhaps one day, on foreign-made soles with heels long since worn down, feeling myself a ghost despite the idiotic substantiality of the insulators, I shall again come out of that station without visible companions, walk along the footpath that accompanies the highway, the 10 or so versts to Leshino. One after another, the telegraph poles will hum at my approach. A crow will settle on a boulder, settle and strengthen a wing that is folded wrong. The day will probably be on the grayish side. Changes in the appearance of the surrounding landscape that I cannot imagine, as well as some of the oldest landmarks that somehow I have forgotten, will greet me alternately, even mingling from time to time. I think that as I walk I shall utter something like a moan, in tune with the poles. When I reach the site where I grew up and see this and that, or else because of fires, rebuilding, lumbering operations of the negligence of nature, see neither this nor that, but this still make out something infinitely and unwaveringly faithful to me, if only because my eyes are in the long run made of the same stuff as the grayness, the clarity, the dampness of those sights, that after all the excitement I shall experience a certain satiation of suffering, perhaps on the mountain pass to a kind of happiness which it is too early for me to know. I know only when I reach it, it will be with pen in hand. There is one thing I shall definitely not find there awaiting me, the thing which indeed made the whole business of exile worth cultivating, my childhood and the fruits of my childhood. Its fruits, here they are, today already ripe, while my childhood itself has disappeared into a distance even more remote than that of our Russian north. The author has found effective words to describe sensation experienced upon making the transition to the countryside. How much fun it is, says he, when no longer one needs to put on a cap or change one's light shoes in order to run out again in the spring on the brick-colored sand of the garden. At the age of 10, a new diversion was added. We were still in the city when the marvel rolled in. For quite a time I led it around by its ram horns from room to room. With what bashful grace it moved along the parquet floor until it impaled itself on a thumbtack. Compared to my old rattling and pitiful little tricycle, those wheels were so thin that it would get stuck even in the sand of the garden terrace. The newcomer possessed a heavenly lightness of movement. This is well expressed by the poet in the following lines. Oh, that first bicycle, its splendor, its height, due pobeda inscribed on its frame, the quietness of its tight tire, the wavers and weavers in the green avenue where sun macules glide up one's wrists and where molehills loom black and threaten one's downfall. But next day one skims over them at the support and in dreamland is lacking, and thrusting in its dream simplicity the bicycle does not collapse. And the day after that there inevitably came thoughts of free-wheeling, a word which to this day I cannot hear without seeing a strip of smooth sloping sticky ground glide past, accompanied by a barely audible murmur of rubber and an ever so gentle lisp of steel. Bicycling and riding, boating and bathing, tennis and croquet, picnicking under the pines, the lure of the water mill and the hayloft. This is a general list of themes that move our author. What about his poems from the point of view of form? These, of course, are miniatures, but they are executed with a phenomenally delicate mastery that brings out clearly every hair, not because everything is delineated with an excessively selective touch, but because the presence of the smallest features is involuntarily conveyed to the reader by the integrity and reliability of talent that assures the author's observance of all the articles of the artistic covenant. One can argue whether it is worth while to revive album-type poetry, but one certainly cannot deny that within the limits he has set himself, Goodenough Sherdentsev has solved his prosodic problem correctly. Each of his poems iridices with harlequin colors. Whoever is fond of the picturesque genre will appreciate this little volume. To the blind man at the church door it would have nothing to say. What vision the author has, awakening early in the morning, he knew what kind of day it would be by looking at a chink in the shutter which, showed a blue that was bluer than blue, and was hardly inferior in blueness to my present remembrance of it. And in the evening he gazes with the same screwed-up eyes in the flailed on side of which is already in shadow, while the other, farther one, is illumined from the central big boulder to the edge of the forest beyond it, and is brightest by day. It would seem to us that perhaps it is really not literature, but painting for which he was destined from childhood, and while we know nothing of the author's present condition, we can nevertheless clearly picture a straw-hatted boy, sitting very uncomfortably on a garden bench with his watercolor paraphernalia, and painting the world bequeathed him by his forebears. Cells of white porcelain contain blue, green, red honey. First, out of pencil lines, on rough paper a garden is formed, the birches, the balcony of the outbuilding. All is spotted with sunlight. I soak and twirl tight the tip of my paintbrush, its rich orange-yellow, and meantime within full goblet. In the radiance of its cut glass, what colors ablaze, what rapture is bloomed. This, then, is Godunov's Cherdintsev little volume. In conclusion, let us add, what else? Imagination, do prompt me. Can it be true that all the enchantingly throbbing things for which I have dreamt, and still dream through my poems, have not been lost in them, and have been noticed by the reader whose review I shall see before the day is over? Can it really be that he has understood everything in them, understood that besides the good old picturesqueness, they also contain special poetic meaning, when one's mind, after going around itself in the subliminal labyrinth, returns with new-found music, that alone makes poems what they should be? As he read them, did he read them not only as words, but as chinks between words, as one should do when reading poetry, or did he simply skim over them, like them, and praise them, calling attention to the significance of their sequence, a feature fashionable in our time, when time is in fashion? If collection opens with a poem about the lost ball, it must close with a found ball. Only pictures and icons remained in their places that year, when childhood was ended and something happened to the old house. In a hurry, all the rooms with each other were exchanging their furniture, cupboards, and screens, and a host of unwieldy big things, and it was then that from under the sofa, on the suddenly unmasked parquet, alive and incredibly dear, it was revealed in a corner. The book's exterior appearance is pleasing. Having squeezed the final drop of sweetness from it, Fedor stretched and got up from his couch. He felt very hungry. The hands of his watch had lately begun to misbehave, now and then starting to move counterclockwise, so that he could not depend on them. To judge by the light, however, the day about to leave on a journey, he sat down with his family for a pensive pause. When Fedor went outside, he felt immersed in a damp chill. It's a good thing that I put it on. While he had been musing over his poems, rain had lacquered the street from end to end. The van had got on a spot where the tractor had recently stood. There remained next to the sidewalk a rainbow of oil, with the purple predominant of a plume-like twist, asphalt's parakeet. And what had been the name of the moving company? Max Look. Did I take the keys? Fedor suddenly thought, stooping and thrusting his hand into his raincoat pocket. There he located a clinking handful, weighty and reassuring. When 3 years ago, still during his existence here as a student, his mother had moved to Paris to live with Tanya, she had written that she just could not get used to being liberated from the perpetual fetters that chain a Berliner to the door lock. He imagined her joy upon reading the article about him, and for an instant he felt maternal pride toward himself. Not only that, but a maternal tear burned the edge of his eyelids. But what do I care whether or not I receive attention during my lifetime, if I am not certain that the world will remember me until its last darkest winter, marveling like Ronsard's old woman? And yet I am still a long way from 30, and here today I am already noticed. Thank you, my land, for this remotest. A lyric possibility flitted past, singing quite close to his ear. Thank you, my land, for your most precious. I no longer need the sound oldest to rhyme with the kindled life, but the rhyme itself is abandoned. And the maddest gift my thanks are due, I suppose Meshes waits in the wings. Did not have time to make out my third line in that burst of light. Pity. All gone now, missed my cue. He bought some piroshki, one with meat, another with cabbage, a third with tapioca, a fourth with rice, a fifth could not afford of the country's cuisine, and quickly finished them off on a damp bench in a small public garden. The rain began coming down faster. Someone had suddenly tilted the sky. He had to take cover in a circular shelter at the streetcar shop. There on the bench, 2 Germans with briefcases were discussing a deal and endowing it with such dialectic details that the nature of the merchandise was lost. as when you are looking through an article in Brockhouse's encyclopedia and lose its subject, indicated in the text only by its initial letter. Shaking her bobbed hair, a girl entered the shelter with a small, wheezing, toad-like bulldog. Now this is odd. Remotest and noticed are together again, and a certain combination is ringing persistently. I will not be tempted. The shower ended. With perfect simplicity, no dramatics, no tricks, all the street lamps came on. He decided he could already set off for the Chernyshevskys in order so as to be there towards 9, Rhine, fine, Klein. As happens with drunks, something preserved him. When he crossed streets in this state, illuminated by a street lamp's humid ray, a car stood at the curb with its motor running. Every single drop on its hood was trembling. Who could have written it? Fedor could not make a final choice among several emigre critics. This one was scrupulous but untalented, that one dishonest but gifted, a third wrote only about prose, a fourth only about his friends, a fifth, and Fedor's imagination conjured up the fifth one, a man of the same age as he, or even, he thought, a year younger, who had published during those same years, in those same emigre papers and magazines, no more than he, a poem here, an article there, but who in some incomprehensible manner, which seemed as physically natural as some kind of emanation, had unobtrusively clothed himself in an aura of indefinable fame, so that his name was uttered not necessarily especially often, but quite differently from all the other young names, a man whose every new searing line he, Fedor, despising himself, quickly and avidly devoured in a corner, trying the very act of reading to destroy the marvel of it, after which for 2 days or so he could not rid himself either of what he had read, or of his own feeling of debility, or of a secret ache, as if, while wrestling with another, he had injured his own innermost sacrosanct particle, a lonely, unpleasant, myopic man with some kind of unpleasant defect in the reciprocal position of his shoulder blades. But I shall forgive everything if it is you. He thought he was keeping his pace to a dawdle, yet the clocks that he came across on the way, the emergent giants of watchmakers' shops, advanced even more slowly, and when almost at his destination he overtook in one stride Lyubov Markovna, who was going to the same place. He understood that he had been borne along throughout his journey by his impatience, as by an escalator that transforms even a motionless man into a runner. Why did this flabby, unloved elderly woman still make up her eyes when she already wore a pince-nez? The lenses exaggerated the unsteadiness and crudity of the amateurish ornamentation, and as a result her perfectly innocent gaze became so ambiguous that one could not break away from it, the hypnosis of error. In fact, nearly everything about her seemed based on unfortunate misunderstanding, and one wondered if it was not even a form of insanity when she thought that she spoke German like a native, that Galsworthy was a great writer, that Georgy Ivanovich Vasilev was pathologically attracted to her. She was one of the most faithful frequenters of the literary parties of the Chernyshevskys, together with Vasilev, a fat old journalist organized every other Saturday. Today was only Tuesday, and Lyubov Markovna was still sitting on her impressions from the previous day, living on her impressions from the previous Saturday, sharing them generously. Men fatally became absent-minded bores in her company. Fedor himself felt he was slipping too, but fortunately they were coming to the front door, and there the Chernyshevskys' maid already stood waiting, keys in hand. Actually, she had been sent to meet Vasilev, who suffered from an extremely rare disease of the heart valves. He had, in fact, made a hobby of it, and sometimes arrived at the home of friends with an anatomical model of the heart and demonstrated everything clearly and lovingly. We don't need the elevator, said Lyubov Markovna, and started up the stairs with a strong plodding gait, which turned into a curiously smooth and silent swing on the landings. Fedor had to zigzag behind her at a reduced pace, as you sometimes see a dog do, weaving and shoving its nose past its master's heel, now on the right, now on the left. They were admitted by Alexandra Yakovlevna herself. Fedor had scarcely time to notice her usual expression as she disapproved of something or wanted to avert something quickly, when her husband darted into the hallway on his short, plump legs, waving a newspaper as he ran. "Here it is," he shouted, the corner of his mouth violently jerking downward, a tic acquired since the death of his son. "Look, here it is. When I married him," observed Madame Chernyshevsky, "I expected his humor to be more subtle." Fedor saw with surprise that the paper he uncertainly took from his host was a German one. "The date," shouted Chernyshevsky. Go ahead, look at the date, young man. April 1st, said Fedor with a sigh, and unconsciously he folded up into paper. Yes, of course, I should have remembered. Chernyshevsky began to guffaw ferociously. Don't be cross with him, please, said his wife in an indolently sorrowful tone, slightly rolling her hips and gently taking the young man by the wrist. Lyubov Markovna clicked her purse shut and sailed off toward the parlor. It was a smallish, rather tastelessly furnished, badly lighted room, with a shadow lingering in one corner and a pseudo Tanagra vase standing on an unattainable shelf, and when at last the final guest had arrived and Madame Chernyshevsky, becoming for a moment, as usually happens, remarkably similar to her own blue gleaming teapot, began to pour tea, the cramped quarters assumed the guise of certain touching provincial coziness. On the sofa, among cushions of various hue, all of them unappetizing and blurry, a silk doll with an angel's lip legs and a person's almond-shaped eyes was being squeezed alternately by two comfortably settled persons, Vasilev, huge, bearded, wearing pre-war socks arrowed above the ankle, and fragile, charmingly debilitated girl with pink eyelids, in general appearance like a white mouse. Her first name was Tamara, which would have better suited the doll, and her last was reminiscent of one of those German mountain landscapes that hang in picture-framing shops. Fedor sat by the bookshelf and tried to simulate good spirits, despite the lump in his throat. Kern, a civil engineer who prided himself on having been a close acquaintance of the late Alexander Blok, the celebrated poet, was producing a gluey sound as he extracted a date from an oblong carton. Lyubov Markovna carefully examined the pastries on a large plate with a poorly pictured bumblebee, and suddenly botching her investigation, contented herself with a bun, with sugar-powdered kind, that always bears an anonymous fingerprint. The host was telling an ancient story about a medical student's April Fool's prank on Kiev, but the most interesting person in the room sat a little distance apart by the writing desk and did not take part in the general conversation, which, however, he followed with quiet attention. He was a youth somewhat resembling Fedor, not so much in facial features, which at that moment were difficult to distinguish, but in the tonality of his general appearance, the dunnish auburn shade of the round head, which was closely cropped, a style which, according to the rules of a latter-day St. Petersburg romanticism, was more becoming to the poet than shaggy locks. The transparency of the large, tender, slightly protruding ears, the slenderness of the neck with the shadow of hollow of its nape. He sat in the same pose as Fedor sometimes assumed, head slightly lowered, legs crossed, arms not so much crossed as hugging each other, as if he felt chilled, so that the repose of the body was expressed more by angular projections, knee, elbow, thin shoulder, and the contraction of all the members, rather than by the general softening of the frame. When a person is relaxing and listening, the shadows of 2 volumes standing on the desk mimicked a cuff in the corner of a lapel, while the shadow of a 3rd volume, which was leaning against the others, might have passed for a necktie. He was about 5 years younger than Fedor, and as far as the face itself was concerned, if one judged by the photographs on the walls of the room and in the adjacent bedroom of the little table between twin beds that wept at night, there was perhaps no resemblance at all if you discounted a certain elongation of outline combined with the prominent frontal bones and the dark depth of the eye sockets, Pascal-like, according to the physiognomists. And also there might have been something in common with the breadth of the eyebrows, but no, it was not a matter of ordinary resemblance, but of generic spiritual similarity between 2 angular and sensitive boys, each odd in its own way. This youth sat with downcast eyes and a trace of mockery on his lips, in a modest, not very comfortable position, on a chair along whose seat copper tracks glinted. To the left of the dictionary-cluttered desk, the Alexander Yakovlevich Chernyshevsky, with a convulsive effort, as if regaining lost balance, would tear his gaze away from that shadowy youth as he went on with the jaunty banter behind which he tried to conceal his mental sickness. "Don't worry, there will be reviews," he said to Fedor, winking involuntarily. "You can be sure the critics will squeeze out your blackheads." "By the way," asked his wife, "what do those weavers and wavers mean exactly in the poem about the bicycle?" Fedor explained, relying more on gestures than on words. "You know, when you are learning to ride a bike and you sort of swerve from side to side." "Doubtful expression," remarked Vasilev. "My favorite is the one about the children's diseases." "Yes," said Alexander Yakovlevich, nodding to herself. "That's good. Christmas time, scarlet fever, and Easter time, diphtheria." "Why not the other way around?" inquired Tamara. Oh, how the boy had loved poetry. The glass-doored bookcase in the bedroom was full of his books. Gumilev and Heredia, Blok and Rieck, and how much he knew by heart. And the notebooks, one day she and I will have to sit down and go through it all. She has the strength to do it, and I don't. Strange how one keeps postponing things. One would think it would be a pleasure, the only bitter pleasure, to go through the belongings of the dead, yet as stuff goes on lying there untouched, the provident laziness of one's soul. It is unthinkable that a stranger should touch it, but what a relief it would be if an accidental fire were to destroy that precious little cabinet. Chernyshevsky abruptly got up, and as if by chance moved the chair by the desk in such a way that neither it nor the shadows of the books could serve as a theme for the phantom. By then the talk had shifted to some unlamented Soviet politician who had fallen from power after Lenin's death. "Oh, in the years I knew him, he was at the height of glory and good deeds," the journalist Vasilev was saying, professionally misquoting Pushkin, who has hope, not height. The boy who looked like Fedor, to whom the Chernyshevskys had become so attached for this very reason, was now by the door, where he paused before leaving the room, half turning toward his father, and despite his purely imaginary nature, how much more substantial he was than all those sitting in the room. The sofa could be seen through Vasilev and the pale girl. Curran, the engineer, was represented only by the glint of his pince-nez, so as Lyubov Markovna and Fedor itself existed only because of a vague congruity with the deceased, while Yasha was perfectly real and alive, and only the instinct of self-preservation prevented one from taking a good look at his features. But perhaps, thought Fedor, perhaps this is all wrong. Perhaps he, Alexander Yakovlevich Chernyshevsky, is not imagining his dead son at all right now, as I am imagining him doing. He may be really occupied with the conversation, and if his eyes are wandering, it may only be because he has always been fidgety, poor soul. I am unhappy, I am bored, nothing rings true here, and I don't know why I keep sitting here listening to nonsense. However, he still continued to sit there and smoke and gently swing the toe of his foot, while the others talked on, and he talked on himself, and he tried, as he did everywhere and always, to imagine the inner transparent motion of this or that other person. He would carefully seat himself inside the interlocutor as in an armchair, so that the other's elbows would serve as armrests for him, and his soul would fit snugly into the other's soul. And then the lighting of the world would suddenly change, and for a minute he would actually become Alexander Chernyshevsky, or Lyubov Markovna, or Vasilev. Sometimes a sporting excitement would be added to the seltzer-like effervescence of the transformation, and he felt flattered when a chance word aptly confirmed the train of thought he was divining in the other. He, to whom so-called politics, that ridiculous sequence of pacts, conflicts, aggravations, frictions, discords, collapses, and the transformation of perfectly innocent little towns into dames of international treaties, meant nothing, would sometimes immerse himself with a thrill of curiosity and revulsion to the vast bowels of Vasilev, and live for an instant, actuated by his, Vasilev's, inner mechanism, where next to the Locarno button there was one for lookout, and where a pseudo-clever, pseudo-entertaining game was conducted by such ill-matched symbols as the 5 Kremlin rulers, or the Kurd rebellion, or individual surnames that had lost all human connotations. Hindenburg, Marx, Pleniv, he wrote, whose macrocephalic initial in Russian, the reverse E, had become so autonomous in the columns of Vasilev's Gazeta as to threaten a complete rift with the original Frenchman. This was a world of prophetic utterances, presentiments, mysterious combinations. A world that was in fact 100-fold more spectral than the most abstract dream. And when Fedor moved over into Madame Chernyshevsky, he found himself within a soul where not everything was alien to him, but where he marveled at many things, as a prim traveler might marvel at the customs of a distant land. The bazaar at sunrise, the naked children, the din, the monstrous size of fruit. This 45-year-old, plain, indolent woman, who 2 years ago had lost her only son, had suddenly become alive, mourning had given her wings, and tears had rejuvenated her, or at any rate so had known her before. The memory of her son, which in her husband had become an illness, burned in her with a quickening fervor. It would be incorrect to say that this fervor filled her completely. No, it far exceeded the confines of her soul, seeming even to ennoble the absurdity of those 2 rented rooms into which, after the tragedy, she and her husband had moved from the large Indin-Zelten apartment where her brother had lived with his family back in the years before the war. Now she regarded all her friends only in the light of their receptivity toward her loss, and also for greater precision recalled or imagined Yasha's opinion of this or that individual with whom she had kept up acquaintance. She was seized by the fever of activity. With the thirst for abundant response, her child grew within her, and struggled to issue forth. The literary circle newly founded by her husband jointly with Vasilev, in order to give himself and her something to do, seemed to her the best possible posthumous honor for her poet son. It was just at that time that I first saw her, and was more than a little perplexed, when suddenly this plump, terribly animated little woman with dazzling blue eyes burst into tears at the midst of her first conversation with me, as if a brimful crystal vessel had broken for no apparent reason, and without taking her dancing gaze off me, laughing and sobbing, started saying over and over, "Goodness, how you remind me of him!" The frankness with which, during our subsequent meetings, she spoke about her son, about all the details of his death, and about the way she now dreamed of him, as if big with him, and translucent as a bubble, seemed to me vulgar and shameless. It irked me even more when I learned incorrectly that she was a little hurt that I did not answer her with corresponding vibrations, but instead only changed the subject the moment she mentioned my own grief and my own loss. Very soon, however, I noticed that this rapture of sorrow in which she managed to live without dying of a ruptured aorta was beginning somehow to draw me in and make demands on me. You know that characteristic movement when someone hands you a treasured photograph and watches you in anticipation, and you, having lengthily and piously gazed at the face in the snapshot, which smiles innocently and without a thought of death, feign to delay its return, feign to regard your own hand, while in a lingering glance you give back the picture, as if it would have been impolite to part with it sooner? This sequence of movements she and I repeated endlessly. Her husband would sit at his brightly lit desk in the corner, working and occasionally clearing his throat. He was compiling his dictionary of Russian technical terms, commissioned by a German publisher. All was quiet and wrong. The remains of a cherry jam mingled with cigarette ash in my saucer. The more she continued to tell about Yasha, the less attractive he grew. Oh no, he and I bore little resemblance to each other, far less than she supposed, projecting inward the coincidental similarity of external features, of which, moreover, she found additional ones that did not exist in reality, that little was within us corresponded to the little there was without. And I doubt we would have become friends if he and I had ever met. His somberness interrupted by the sudden shrill gaiety characteristic of humorless people, the sentimentality of his intellectual enthusiasms, his purity, which would have strongly suggested timidity of the senses were it not for the morbid over-refinement of their interpretation, his feeling for Germany, his tasteless spiritual throes, for a whole week, he said, I was in a daze after reading Spengler, and finally his poetry, in short everything that to his mother was filled with enchantment, only repelled me. As a poet he was, in my opinion, very feeble. He did not create. He merely dabbled in poetry, just as thousands of intelligent youths of his type did. But if they did not meet with some kind of more or less heroic death, having nothing to do with Russian letters, which, however, they knew meticulously, those notebooks of Yasha's filled with prosodic diagrams expressing modulations of rhythm in the tetrameter, they subsequently abandoned literature altogether, as if they exhibited talent in some field it would be in silence and administration, or else simply in a well-ordered life. His poems, replete with fashionable cliches, exalted his grievous love of Russia, autumn scenes a la Essen, and smoky blue of blockish bogs, and powder snow upon the wooden paving blocks of Mandelstam's neoclassicism, and the Neva's granite parapet, on which one can scarcely discern today the imprint of Pushkin's elbow. The mother would read them to me, stumbling in her agitation, with an awkward schoolgirl intonation which did not at all suit those tragically scudded iambics. Yasha himself must have recited them in an oblivious sing-song, dilating his nostrils and swaying with a bizarre blaze in a kind of lyric pride, after which he would immediately sink back, again becoming humble, limp, and withdrawn. The sonorous epithets that lived in his throat, Neverayatny, incredible, Haladny, cold, and Krakashny, beautiful, epithets avidly employed by the young poets of his generation under the delusion that archaisms, prosaisms, or simply destitute words having completed their life circle, now when used in poems gained a kind of unexpected freshness, returning from the opposite direction. These words in Nam Chernyshevsky's stumbling diction made, as it were, another half-cycle, faded away again, and again revealed their decrepit poverty, thus exposing the deception of style. Besides patriotic elegies, Yasha had poems about low hunts of adventurous sailors, about gin and jazz, which he pronounced in the German way as yachts, and poems about Berlin in which he attempted to endow German proper names with lyric voice in the same way. For instance, in its Italian street names resound in a Russian poetry with a suspiciously euphonious contralto. He also had poems dedicated to friendship without rhyme and without meter, full of muddled, hazy, timid emotions, and some internal spiritual bickerings and apostrophes to a male friend in the polite form, the Russian V, as a sick Frenchman addresses God, or a young Russian poetress her favorite gentleman. And all this was expressed in a pale, haphazard manner, with many vulgarisms and incorrect word accents peculiar to his provincial middle-class set. Misled by its augmentative suffix, he assumed that požarishish, the site of a recent fire, meant a big fire, and I also remember a rather pathetic reference to Rublyov's frescoes, an amusing cross between two Russian painters, Rublyov and Vrubel, that only served to prove our dissimilarity. No, he could not have loved painting as I do. My true opinion of his poetry I concealed from his mother, while the forced sounds of inarticulate approbation that I politely made were construed by her as signs of incoherent rapture. For my birthday she gave me, beaming through her tears, Yasha's best necktie, an old-fashioned affair of watered silk, freshly ironed, with still discernible the label of a well-known but not elegant shop. I hardly think Yasha himself ever wore it, and in exchange for everything which she had shared with me for her, giving me a complete and detailed image of her late son, with his poetry, his neurasthenia, his enthusiasms, his death, Madame Chernyshevsky imperiously demanded from me a certain amount of creative collaboration.